Si dicevi chiudere in bellezza, direi dulcis in fundo, sì, anche se un po' è anche in cauda venenum, perché questo libro, di cui vi consiglio la lettura, questo libro è un pugno nello stomaco. Il titolo è la quarta volta, siamo annegati. Sally Hayden, 34 anni, giornalista irlandese. Roberto Saviano l'ha appena definita sul Corriere della Sera una delle più importanti reporter del mondo in tema di immigrazione, e noi siamo felici che la conferenza di Oasis oggi sia coincisa con la sua visita in Italia per lanciare appunto l'edizione italiana di questo libro per la Bollati Boringhieri, e ci ha dato l'opportunità di farvela conoscere e incontrare. Il suo libro, dicevo, è un pugno nello stomaco. Sally lavora e ha lavorato fra Dublino e l'Africa per grandi testate giornalistiche, pur cominciando molto giovane da freelance. Ha lavorato per CNN, Vice, Irish Times, New York Times, Washington Post, e questo libro ha vinto già numerosi premi giornalistici. Adesso esce in Italia. E dicevo, un pugno nello stomaco, andrei subito al dunque, no? Tutto comincia, Sally, tutto comincia il 26 agosto del 2018, si materializza con un messaggio di Facebook. Una persona, un ragazzo eritreo, ti scrive via Facebook, poi questo colloquio, a cui dai credito, diventa una chiacchierata su WhatsApp, e questo giovane eritreo ti scrive: siamo in prigione in Libia, e tu lo prendi sul serio. Ieri sera mi hai raccontato che in realtà non era stata affatto la prima persona a cui questo messaggio era arrivato, come tu avevi pensato per un certo tempo. In realtà questo messaggio non era mai stato raccolto da nessuno. Tu invece lo prendi sul serio. Lo prendi sul serio e lo fai diventare qualcosa.
Speak in English, obviously. Sorry that I can't speak Italian. Yeah, thank you so much for having me here. I really appreciate it, and it's been very fascinating so far, and it's a very important conversation. In terms of my reporting, like you said, that my reporting on Libya started with that message in 20...
Sorry if I interrupt you, ma noi abbiamo la traduzione in simultanea o no? Io avevo capito che avevamo la traduzione in simultanea, però non la sento. Ah, solo con le cuffie, scusate. Go ahead. I didn't understand that.
Oh, okay.
Only the people who has the headphones.
Oh, sorry.
Hear your Italian version, the Italian version of what you are saying. So go ahead. It's okay.
Yeah, like you said, my reporting on Libya specifically started with that Facebook message, but I had been reporting on migration for quite a long time before that. Just as a general news reporter, you know, you're covering lots of different things that were going on, and one of the things that I would be covering is, you know, there was a shipwreck today, 200 people died, but in kind of maybe a slightly removed way, you know, like you cover a shipwreck and you move on to the next thing, then the next thing. And when I started receiving messages from people in Libyan migrant detention centers, it wasn't my first time meeting refugees or anything like that, but what became quite clear was actually that they were in the situation they were in because of European migration policy. And for me, that was basically a shock, because I'm from Ireland, I'm European, and so the people that contacted me first, they had been locked up in a detention center for months. They hadn't been charged with anything. They didn't have access to lawyers, of course. They were being abused, sometimes tortured, sometimes starved. And basically the reason that they could contact me in the end was that a war broke out around them, and the guards who had been abusing them ran away. And at that point, that was when we became in communication. And I started appealing for help for them, and I thought this must be a mistake. There were pregnant women in there, there were children, people were screaming down the phone to me, and I thought this must be a mistake. This can't have happened, on purpose. It must be an oversight. But actually what it turned out was that there were thousands of people locked up in those detention centers. At the time, more than 600 children were among them, and that basically, the majority of those people had tried to cross the sea to reach either Italy or Malta, and had been intercepted by the Libyan Coast Guard, which is supported by the EU since 2017 in what is a circumnavigation of international law. So I'm sure people here know European vessels cannot return people to Libya, but Libyan vessels can, even if the boats are spotted by European surveillance and the Libyan vessels are supported by the EU. And so realizing this shocked me so much as a European that it basically led me to spend years reporting on this. And I was in communication, daily communication with people in detention centers who were using hidden phones to send me messages and send me evidence about what they were going through. The book, which is now out in Italian, I can't pronounce the name, is available in the bookshop here. And it's actually, to be honest, it's only the tip of the iceberg in terms of the information that I received. And what I received is obviously the tip of the iceberg in terms of the broader situation. But I think it is clear often what's happening in Europe is painted as inaction. And actually, there has been decisive and prolonged action, including aimed at keeping people off our territory. And what my reporting would show is that huge amounts of money are being spent in ways that are actually propping up militias, dictatorships, and systems that oppress people further, and are actually destabilizing large portions of Africa and increasing the reasons why they need to flee. And at the same stage, we as Europeans are becoming culpable for crimes against humanity and war crimes. And the book has been cited in a submission to the International Criminal Court, calling for named EU officials to be investigated for crimes against humanity. And it's also been used in the legal challenge against the UK Home Office, trying to stop the Rwanda deportations. It's been used in cases by prosecutors who are taking cases against traffickers as well. But yeah, I think, the topic of this day is to, potentially chart a new route. You can't do that without understanding the current reality, and you can't do that without understanding the consequences of our policies as they exist.
Tu scrivi molto chiaramente a un certo punto del libro, no? Quest'ipocrisia europea di far usare la forza, il blocco navale attraverso i finanziamenti ai dittatori locali del Nord Africa, in particolare giocando sul caos della Libia, no? Ma poi scrivi una cosa che mi ha colpito, perché prima ne ha accennato anche Sua Eccellenza Monsignor Perego, perché noi viviamo questo paradosso, e tu scrivi questa frase che mi ha colpito: molti avevano diritto alla protezione internazionale, al diritto d'asilo, ma i profughi sono costretti a raggiungere illegalmente un paese europeo perché questo diritto d'asilo venga riconosciuto dall'Europa. Cioè l'Europa fa finta di non sapere che esiste questo diritto d'asilo finché quello non arriva illegalmente nei nostri territori. E questo è ancora più grande dell'ipocrisia di pagare la Guardia Costiera libica. A me pare ancora più enorme perché è contro il diritto romano. Caspita, è contro le basi di quello che l'antica Roma riconosceva al civus romanus che viveva in Palestina. Invece non si riconosce il diritto europeo non riconosce il diritto d'asilo se non nel momento in cui metto piedi in Europa. I don't know if I understand well.
Yeah, I think I got it. Yeah, I mean, since I started reporting on migration, a lot of things that I thought that I knew have been challenged, and a lot of the rhetoric that politicians use, the sound bites, it's made me very much question it and the way they speak about it. I don't know if they have this in Italy, but certainly in the UK, politicians are constantly talking about queue jumpers. Like, they talk about people jumping queues and how they shouldn't be traveling illegally because they should be taking legal routes. And certainly my reporting has shown that those legal routes are, basically non-existent. And for example, actually, the reason that I ended up getting contacted by refugees in Libya, I didn't know this at the time, was that I had done a big investigation in Sudan, which neighbors Libya, into the UN Refugee Agency's resettlement scheme. So what that's supposed to be is a chance for the most vulnerable refugees to be taken to a safe country, generally in the West. And it's reliant on those countries offering spaces, and there are never enough spaces, so there's never enough chance to take that. But what refugees in Sudan were telling me was that because of this scarcity, there's a lot of room for exploitation. And what they said was that people associated with the UNHCR were charging bribes of up to $20,000 to resettle a family. And I ended up doing an investigation into this. The UNHCR then launched their own investigation and temporarily suspended resettlement, and they did find one staff member guilty of soliciting bribes and abusing power. But that really made me start to question, what does it mean when we talk about legal routes, and the fact that, like, the refugees that I speak to, they don't have faith in that process. They say that there is exploitation. I even interviewed a UN investigator who uncovered a similar scheme in Kenya, and he said when you have huge demand and tiny supply, there's always going to be some form of exploitation. And in Sudan, the refugees were telling me, it's cheaper to travel through Libya than it is to go the so-called legal route through the UNHCR. And I should add that UNHCR has denied widespread corruption, but I think that it does make you start to question, those systems. I was actually in Tunisia last month, and I was interviewing people who are in the resettlement process for the US, and they've been told that their applications have provisionally been accepted, but they've been waiting already for 4 years, and they're just waiting, doing nothing for the chance to restart their lives. And one man who was in the shelter, who's from Darfur, told me that 5 people who are in that scheme have died trying to cross the sea because they've given up hope of the process ever being completed. So it's made me think a lot about, the terms that we use and what we're expecting of people who are just looking for a chance to live a dignified and safe life.
Ci sarebbero molte cose, molte curiosità. Io ho segnato un sacco di domande, ma mi colpisce, tu sei stata recentemente anche in Tunisia, no? E tu sai che l'Italia ha puntato molto in questi ultimi mesi su questo memorandum di Cartagine, cioè su un possibile accordo che un po' a noi fa effetto, perché leggendo poi il tuo libro non ne parliamo, perché sembra un po' replicare il modello Libia, no? Tu che impressione hai avuto stando lì? Cioè, il regime di Kais Saied spinge i profughi verso Lampedusa, verso il deserto? Cosa sta accadendo adesso dentro la Tunisia?
So I was in Tunisia, in Tunis and Sfax, and I spoke to a lot of people from a lot of different countries, like people who've fled the war in Sudan, people who've fled drought in Somalia, people from Senegal, Ivory Coast, Burkina Faso, Sierra Leone, lots of different places, escaping lots of different situations, some escaping crushing poverty, some escaping war, some dictatorship. Whole families were waiting to cross. Normally in the images you see men, but I met people with all of their children. like parents, or I met women as well whose husbands had died in the desert. And I think like one of the things that gets lost a little bit is in the framing of this, what we have is a global inequality crisis. We have a situation where, you know, as one European official actually described it to me, we have the haves and the have-nots. And what he said is, you know, when basically the policies are being implemented because the haves do not want to share with the have-nots. And a large proportion of the planet, they just don't have, they say they don't have any other way to move. This is the only way that they can move. They can't access visas, they can't get on planes. And in Tunisia, a significant number that I met also said that they had actually been working there for quite a long time, like years in some cases. But Kais Said in February made comments about Black Africans, saying that they were part of a criminal plot to kind of change the demographics of Tunisia. And at that point, they were evicted from their homes, they were fired from their jobs, and they said then they had no choice but to go to Tunisia. And I mean, proving exact motivation is always, you know, a bit risky as a journalist or speculating on it. But I know that in Sfax recently, thousands of people were rounded up and, at least according to an Al Jazeera report, actually bussed to a place where the boats are taking off from and then left. And yeah, I think that the way that you know, authoritarian or semi-authoritarian regimes are using the EU to basically get large sums of money, you know, what is the long-term ramification of that? And one case is, again, it's not just Tunisia, it's not just Libya, like Sudan. The RSF, who are now at war, were said to have been emboldened by EU anti-migration funding. So the EU denies funding them directly, but indirectly, it's pretty well documented that they benefited. And they're now at war, and more than 5 million people have been displaced by that war. And there are big questions to answer as to how EU funding has been used. And I think no matter your views on migration, you know, billions are being spent effectively to try and stop migration from Africa. And there need to be more serious questions about long-term, is that actually pushing people out of their countries? Because what it's propping up is systems that are oppressive.
C'è un punto controverso di criticità che ti voglio chiedere, perché tu sembri non avere molta fiducia nelle grandi istituzioni internazionali, no? Le Nazioni Unite, le ONLUS, le ONG che operano, internazionali che operano in Africa, eccetera. E anche se, questo ti chiedo, no? Oltre al tuo lavoro giornalistico, il caso Libia è stato uno scandalo mondiale quando ormai 2 anni fa il Consiglio dei diritti umani dell'ONU ha detto che quelli erano lager, cioè ha fatto un rapporto in cui si ripetevano le cose che tu avevi raccontato, cioè che c'era una detenzione, stanze delle torture, detenzioni illegali, un trattamento scientifico, no, dei profughi, oltre ogni, che davvero provocò la famosa definizione di Papa Francesco dei campi libici come lager. Ecco, ma io torno all'inizio, cioè tu pensi che le realtà internazionali, umanitarie, diciamo, e internazionali, istituzionali come l'ONU non siano in grado di fronteggiare questa crisi nel modo giusto?
Yeah, I mean, I think I should always say I'm not the most eloquent person, and everything is better explained in the book. So if I say something that's not fully developed here, it is probably in the book. In terms of international organizations, that was a big thing that I started to look at in my work, because when I started reporting this, I appealed to everybody. I was like, these people I'm in communication with, they need help. Who can help them? I didn't know the context. I really learned as I went on. But it became quite clear quite quickly when I realized why these people were locked up in these centers, and I asked European officials, how are you supporting this policy where people are intercepted? By the way, like now more than 122,000 men, women and children have been caught and forced back to Libya since this policy began in 2017. And when I asked European officials how they're supporting that, they would say, well, you know, we don't approve of the detention centers, but we're funding the UN to improve the situation in them. And I also started being contacted by people in the UN who said that they were very uncomfortable about the fact that they felt that they are being used to whitewash the brutal effects of EU policy, but that they can't speak out about it publicly because there's such an emphasis on getting donations and making sure that you're continuing to get money. And what became clear quite quickly was that the EU Trust Fund for Africa, which supports the Libyan Coast Guard, was also supporting the UN agencies that were then releasing statements that were not clear about why people were in those detention centers. So they'd say things like, thank you to the EU for supporting our, you know, donation of blankets to this detention center today. I'd get a message from someone in the detention center saying the blankets have been carted away by the militia. We don't benefit from this. And the UN, like privately, people would say to me, we can't say anything publicly against the EU because, you know, there are funders. And there's a lot of examples in the book of times when UN statements did not correspond with what was actually happening in detention because it became clear that they didn't have proper access. And it really made me start to question, the role that they're playing, and also that there's this huge disconnect between refugees or migrants, between the people who are actually experiencing the impacts of these policies and the people who are meant to be speaking on behalf of them. And when policymakers meet someone from UNHCR, for example, and that person is speaking on behalf of refugees, they don't necessarily know what is actually happening to the people that they're speaking about, because there's this big disconnect in terms of voices being silenced and those voices not being listened to when they do try to speak. And that was one thing that I just tried to basically just raise up those voices, and I saw that as my role, basically.
Sì, nel libro ci sono molte cose, ci sono soprattutto i racconti delle storie, perché poi noi parliamo sempre astrattamente, invece nel libro sono belli i racconti delle singole storie, dei viaggi, delle difficoltà, delle pazzie, delle nevrosi, dei suicidi, delle donne, dei bambini, insomma ci sono tante cose in questo libro, però concludendo, andando verso il pranzo, ti faccio questa domanda. Io ho fatto il direttore di un telegiornale italiano di All News che si chiama TG24 per 3 anni, ho fatto il vice direttore del TG5 e adesso ancora lavoro in televisione, e ti devo dire una cosa, che quando tutte le volte che tu dici facciamo un pezzo sui migranti, facciamo un'inchiesta sui migranti, facciamo una roba sulla Libia, la violenza, il pubblico e i miei colleghi girano la testa da un'altra parte. Quindi la grande domanda angosciante che tu hai nel libro, che fai a te stessa, ma io la faccio sempre a me stesso, è: come facciamo ad andare contro quella chi è che è un grande scrittore, non mi ricordo più chi, c'è un grande scrittore che credo sia Marcel Proust, che disse: la più grande violenza è l'indifferenza. Problema fondamentale perché questo libro qua, dopo un po' tu dici vabbè, adesso lo metto lì e non ci penso più. Perché la nostra reazione tende sempre a essere questa. Allora, come facciamo a rompere, innanzitutto dentro noi stessi, il muro dell'indifferenza?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and it's one that I've been asking myself absolutely constantly, and I can't say that I fully have an answer. And I even end the book with describing that. This book for me was motivated by my shock, and my shock was that this is being done in my name. And I think that all Europeans, now I speak to a lot of politicians, and they'll all say, yes, we read the book, this is happening, this is the reality, but we're doing it because we think that's what our public wants. And I think that Europeans have been too removed from the actual human consequences of our policies, and we can't be like that anymore because, yeah, like I said, the result is crimes against humanity, war crimes. I do document in the book efforts being made by lawyers to call for accountability, but I always say I'm a journalist, you know, I'm not an activist, I'm not pushing for any particular policy. Everybody needs to decide for themselves, you know, what they would do or what they think should happen. But I mean, for me, the first step is that no one can say that they don't know, and that's been my goal since 2018, and that's why I wrote this book. So thank you so much.
Grazie a te, grazie a te, grazie del tuo lavoro.